Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for coming along to this session with Yann Martel. We'll have a chat about his book. My name's Rafael Epstein from ABC Radio, and we will, of course, give you a chance to ask Yann some questions at the end of the session, and he'll also be at the festival bookshop later on. Yann, thanks for having a chat.
It's a pleasure.
I do want to get into the book, and I want to get into the life of Pi as well, but even before we get to the trip to India, there's lots of, if I can use the words divinity and faith in many of your books. Was there much religion, spirituality at home when you were growing up?
None. None. My parents were children of a phenomenon, an event in Quebec, in French Canada in the early 60s that was called the Quiet Revolution. And it was a period of a year or two in which Quebec went from being the most backward Catholic province in Canada to being the most progressive social democratic. It happened really in a matter of months, and my parents were children of that revolution, and I was a grandchild. So I grew up in a household where art was something you sort of read about in National Geographic, and the questioning that religion claims to want to do was instead done by art.
Right.
So my parents said, if you want to explore who you are, why you are, read great novels. They dragged me to great museums. They, made me listen to music. So those were the tools that I had. So no, I had no relationship with religion or spirituality, really. And if I had, it was largely negative. Things you read about in the newspaper are rarely positive things about religion.
Yes.
The excesses of organized religion. And then I studied philosophy at university, which is another way to not like religion. What I remember, it was a very bracing experience at university doing Descartes' meditations, which include these attempts at proving the existence of God. The moderns discovered reason. Well, let's use reason to prove this thing we already believe in called God. Well, none of the proofs work, but it's a wonderful way to hone your thinking skills to see why they don't work. So no, I had no patience, no tolerance for religion. I knew just enough to hate it. And then that all changed with this a trip to India.
So you've written 2 books when you go to India in '96. What did you expect when you went to India?
I expected a cheap place in which I could write a novel set in Portugal. I went to India because it was inexpensive by Western standards. I'd been there before and I'd loved it, so I thought I'll live on the cheap there and write this novel set in Portugal. And the Portugal novel didn't happen, and so suddenly I was in India, not wanting to be a tourist, but to be a writer, and I had no story to write. And it was expensive to get there. At that time, I had no money, so I was stuck there. And then what happened is I sort of said, well, I'm here, I might as well be here. And so I opened my eyes. And for the first time in my life, I noticed 2 things. I noticed, first of all, animals. It's hard not to notice animals in India, being a tropical country, and one in which animals play an important role in religion. It's hard not to notice animals. And then I noticed religion. And because it was they were exotic manifestations of religion, largely Hinduism, but also Islam, I for the first time looked at it from a less negative point of view. And I started to see aspects that were intriguing, that were quite beautiful. Hindu temples are amazing places. A key concept in Hinduism is darshan, and darshan is viewing the divine. So that's the whole point of visiting a temple. You don't go to a Hindu temple to have a mass, a ceremony. It's basically to see what looks like a little doll. It's dressed up, it has water, it has food, but in fact it's an incarnation, an avatar of the divine, and in glimpsing at it, you glimpse into the divine. And it's kind of this holy womb, and you go to this, at the center of the temple, you see, and they're usually dark and it's moist, and you have darshan, you have a view of this, the inner, the divine creature at the core of this womb. You see it, and that's your connection to the divine, and then you go out. And some of these temples, especially in the south of India, are extraordinary. And so I was moved by that. And
did it surprise you to have yourself opened up to that experience?
It did, and I'm glad it happened, because at that age, I was in my early 30s, I discovered that I was tired of being reasonable. Having done well at university, being reasonably intelligent, having studied philosophy, I was very good at being reasonable, which is a good tool to be able to use, but it's not one that is very useful to use in and of itself. There's no real purpose in being reasonable in and of itself. It's good to be reasonable for a purpose. And so I was just I was drying up on the inside a little bit. And then I was in India, which is a great place to get moist, because India is a very moist, rich place in every way. And so, maybe I was hungering for it. But I'm glad I went to India, let's say, rather than Switzerland. So I was in India, and then
actually,
Life of Pi.
The other Canadian who's obsessed with Reason Not Being Enough is John Ralston Saul, isn't he? And
yes.
Voltaire's, anyway,
he was a good friend of the family, actually.
Right. Okay. I'm just thinking about his with reason with nothing else leads you to a terrible place.
Exactly.
Did you write most of Life of Pi during that? Like, what was the gestation between that trip to India and it coming out and being a success? Was it just this simple, easy flow? What happened?
It was a simple, easy, longish flow. It took me about. I went to India. First time I went to India, I was just following this girl, beautiful girl. She didn't work out, but India worked out. I didn't work out with her, but India worked out. And then so I went a second time, and that's when I abandoned the Portuguese novel. And most of my writing starts with an idea. So it starts in the head, but it's kind of an idea that has emotional resonance. And so I being interested in this religious stuff, seeing all this religious stuff, I posited the idea of exploring faith. What is this odd phenomenon that still bizarrely exists in an age where reason has been so triumphant? How can there still be people who believe in gods? It's ridiculous, but it still happens. So there must be something there. There must be something beyond the homophobia, the anti-Semitism, the patriarchy, etc., the pedophilia. There's got to be something else happening there. I can't believe every religious person isn't all those terrible things. And so I set about exploring it. And so I spent about 6 months in India, visiting temples, churches, mosques, synagogues, and not looking for the nasty little thing on the side there, but looking at what is it all about. And it was a lovely experience. And then I went back to Canada. At the time I was living in Montreal, and I did sort of 2 years of academic research. So I read the Bhagavad Gita and other Hindu classics, the Bible, the Quran, secondary texts about them. Then I read things about shipwrecks, things about animal behavior. And as I was doing that, I wrote notes. This is my standard writing method. I write notes. I have about 350 pages of notes, which I then print out and then cut up and put in envelopes depending on where they belong. And then when I actually start writing, I open up the first envelope. So for example, with Life of Pi, it was the author's note. And those elements, those little bits of paper are the backbones of that section. And it was a lovely experience. I had, writing Life of Pi was a jubilatory experience. I never had any moments of doubt. I was a very happy writer. I was its first reader, and I loved what I was writing. I loved the book that I was reading. I, of course, thought that this is going to go nowhere. It's about a book about religion, and in Canada, certainly, Canada, especially French Canada, is a fiercely anti-religious, anti-clerical society. And generally in Canada, Canada is a very, very secular society, very different from the United States. So I was saying, here I'm writing about religion, and no one likes religion, and I'm writing about zoos, and no one likes zoos. And people who like religion don't read novels, and so I was. This is going to go nowhere, and I was happy to be proven wrong.
How do you integrate? What does it mean if it's sold? You were telling me before 13 million copies. Does that tell you anything in particular?
Well, it tells my accountant a lot.
Yeah. But is it just, wow, I'm a fantastic writer? Is it there's a yearning and a thirst for this sort of writing? What does it tell you?
Success like that makes you aware of your strengths, perhaps, but without curing your weaknesses. You remain the same kind of writer. Your life becomes busier, more complicated, wealthier, but on the inside, it doesn't change at all. Every project I've written since, I have the same, say, oh, this is really good, but I'm not sure about this. And the whole process is, you start at zero, or certainly I start at zero every time. And there's no formula. If there were, there'd be great novels written every day. Yes. So, the subsequent book I wrote after Life of Pi, I wrote on the Holocaust, a novel called Beatrice and Virgil. I've always been interested by the Holocaust, especially its representations, how we talk about it. And that one, had very mixed reviews. Some people loved it, some people absolutely hated it.
Does it matter if reviewers hate them, the books?
No. If they've read it and wrestled with it, it's fine. I don't mind if people didn't like Life of Pi. So long as they've read it, if they've sort of engaged with it, then it doesn't matter. It's about a dialogue.
Yeah.
So you don't want everyone to be praising you, but you want a genuine dialogue. So no, it didn't. I disagreed with the people. I mean, there's 4 kinds of reviews. There's the good reviews who like your book for the right reasons. Then there's the good reviews who like your book for the wrong reasons. Then there's the bad reviews for the right reason. They point out your weaknesses. Those are the ones you hate, actually. When they point out your weaknesses, like the one cliche. Like one in Life of Pi, one reviewer, of all the 300, I used one terrible cliche. Pi says lock, stock, and barrel, which I barely understand what it means anyway. I don't know what lock, stock, but I use that cliche. And some goddamn journalist in England had to point it out. The one errant cliche in the book. So, that one you hate. And then there's the bad reviews for the wrong reasons. They didn't even get your book and they hated it. So I mostly ignore them, but they're all part of the dialogue of offering a gift to the world.
And I do want to talk about High Mountains of Portugal, but quickly, a review of the film, because we all have that experience of book then film or film then book. They're totally different. Were you happy with the film?
I thought it was visually a stunning movie. I wish the screenplay was maybe a bit stronger. I advised the various directors who were involved, and there's a number of them that were involved and then fell to the side for one reason or another. To each of them I sent a very long letter making certain, first of all, explaining what I thought the book was about, which could have been very different from what they thought it was about, and making certain suggestions. And the key one I made that I insisted with every director, and they all ignored it, including Ang Lee, was that in Life of Pi, you get the story with animals first for like 150 pages, and then you get the story without animals for 7 pages. And that order works. But I suggest that in a movie, if you see the second story last, you will tend to believe it more, because we tend to believe, we're such visual animals, we will tend to believe it more if it comes last. So I suggested inverting the order. That have Pi tell the story without animals first. A terrible story of shipwreck with his mother and the French cook and this poor suffering Taiwanese sailor. And then have the other story teased out of him by the investigators. So inverse the order of the stories, and he ignored that. So I thought it sort of limped to an end. But visually it was gorgeous. I mean, I loved all those things in the Pacific with the tiger and the lifeboat and Pi. The contrast in colors worked very well for me.
Beautiful. Look, we'll get into this, what the High Mountains of Portugal is. It is essentially three interconnected stories. I'm sure some of you have read it, but I'm assuming that many of you have not. But I want to leap, Yann, if we can, to the third story. And without giving too much away, there's a man's relationship with a chimpanzee. And if you're okay, if I just read a little bit, I just want you to tell me what you're aiming for. Maybe it's what's obviously here, maybe it's not. Peter has learnt the difficult animal skill of doing nothing. He's learned to unshackle himself from the race of time and contemplate time itself. As far as he can tell, that's what Odo, the chimpanzee, spends most of his time doing. Being in time, like one sits by a river watching the water go by. It's a lesson hard learned, just to sit there and be. So that's the real surprise. Not that Odo would seek to be like him, but that he would seek to be like Odo. So there's still animals there. Is there an intention? There must be a very deliberate intention with the animal. What's it there for?
Well, the thinking behind that is, in a sense, a continuation of what I was exploring with Life of Pi, which is the proper use of reason. And what's remarkable with animals, and this is sort of a banal biological observation, is that animals live in equilibrium with their environment. You know, if a wolf overhunts the deer population and there's no more deer, the wolf population starves, and because there are fewer wolves, the deer population goes up, and then eventually there's so many deer that it's easy for any wolf to catch a deer, so then the wolf population goes up. They get to this position of equilibrium, and this is animals who don't have any sort of intelligence like we have. We have this excess of intelligence, and we're doing phenomenally stupid things with it. We are basically destroying our planet, pollution, climate change, etc. The list of obscenities that we're perpetrating on this planet is endless. So I've always been interested in how do we relativize reason, and what do we have to balance reason. And we certainly have certain models in the animal world. I mean, the animal world is, of course, a brutal world of killing and injustice and all that. But nonetheless, animals have a certain... If you look at animals, they have certain capacities or certain ways of looking at the world that I think would benefit us if we could imitate them. And the main one that I can think of is their capacity to live in the present moment. Most animals live right here, right now. Your average dog is right here, right now. It is not roiled by the past and is not worried about the future, or only in a very, you always say that elephants have great memories, which indeed they do, but they have recourse to their memory only when they need to. So, you leave your dog, you come back in the afternoon, and your dog recognizes you. It has recourse to its memory upon needing it because it's seen you. In other words, this memory is triggered by an event in the present moment. And other than that, they don't think about the past, and they certainly don't contemplate the future. That's something that we have great difficulty doing. We are constantly, as an individuals and as a society, we're constantly dealing with our past and worried about our future. And curiously, that's also a kind of characteristic that you see in divine characters. It's interesting if you look at divine texts, the various texts of various religions, that quality of presence is very much one that you see in people like Krishna or Jesus or Buddha. Buddhist monks spend a lifetime trying to be right here, right now. As I said, animals do it right away. So that's one thing there that Peter notices in this animal. He tries to be like it, to sort of be in a state of grace. And it's one it is hard to do. It is hard to be in the present moment.
So those three stories, you have the young man Tomas, who's grieving and is walking backwards throughout much of his life, and then goes on a trip around the countryside in the search of something. Then there's your pathologist, who conducts autopsies in 1938, so it's a little bit later on, but it's about 3 decades later. And then there's Peter, the man with the chimpanzee, who's a Canadian politician who ends up in Portugal. They're all grieving some type of loss. Is it deliberately about grief, or is it grief as a path to things that you just like to meditate on and luxuriate in around faith and reason?
Well, it's grief as a starting point. I think most stories start with something not being quite right with the universe, with the world. So Life of Pi starts with the ship sinking. I mean, Life of Pi essentially starts with Pi's family, him losing his family, that instance of suffering. And the same thing with this one. In fact, all of my stories start with something going wrong with the routine of one's life, and that's where stories start. So in this one I posit 3 characters, each of whom loses someone very close to them. And then I was interested in seeing what do they do, what tools do they have for dealing with their grief. And each one has a very different approach. If you want to baldly, reduce the novel, part 1 would be atheism, part 2 would be agnosticism, and part 3 would be theism. So part 1 is... I
thought it was young, rushing
too.
through the world, middle-aged, dialectic conversation, maturity, serenity.
Those map over very nicely.
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Those map over very nicely. So, part 3 is about presence, part 1 is about absence, and then part 2 is about where most of us are, where we aspire to presence but are bedeviled by absence. So, yeah, there is a progress. I also wanted to sort of... one of the things that I'm interested in looking at too is our relationship to technology. So in part 3, even though it's the one part 1, that takes place the longest ago, I wanted in some ways imitate how we live today, where we're overwhelmed by technology. So Tomas, this young man, this young curator, his wealthy uncle lends him an automobile, a 1904 Renault. And Tomas is completely overwhelmed by it, as anyone would be, frankly. Driving a car at that time was such a feat of engineering. He's completely, as we are today, overwhelmed by technology. It's supposed to simplify our lives and to give us more leisure time. The washing machine was supposed to liberate women from domestic drudgery. Well, it possibly did that, but it then liberated to get taken over by other kind of drudgeries. The technology never actually simplifies our life. It actually makes it more complicated. So part 1, I wanted to imitate that modern time. And then in the 1980s, where Peter's story takes place with Odo, I wanted to imitate much earlier times. So Peter lives a very stripped away life with no phone, no electricity, no running water. A time, a kind of a simple life that we would imagine in the year 0.
While we're on loss and grief, there's a fantastic meditation with the pathologist Eusebio's wife. I actually copied out bits, but there's this fantastic meditation on why Agatha Christie is sort of the perfect way of looking at the world, or at least looking at mortality, that we're all at least subject to one murder, not the least the murder of ourselves. Which I loved. It's lengthy, And it actually made me go, right, this is why crime procedurals are just the stuff of, that's why there's so much put on TV and so much of it.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Why is it there?
Well, it's funny when you have an idea how it attracts other ideas and things that seem incongruous come together very nicely. That's one thing I've always taken pleasure in doing, and I don't know, I just came to do it, maybe it's just a natural trait, is putting things that seem incongruous and seeing how ultimately they fit together. So Life of Pi was religion and animals. But somehow they go together very nicely. Religion is full of animals, and animals are possessed with a kind of mystery for us, which is why we project so much onto them. And in this case, Agatha Christie has always... First of all, I love her stuff. She's brilliant. Her ambition perfectly matched what she achieved. And one thing that always struck me with her is that she is the world's most popular writer ever. In the history of the written word in any language, she is by far the most sold writer. And which is surprising because, first of all, she's a woman. Sexism has always been around. She is very, very, very English. And she writes in genre fiction, which doesn't appeal to everyone. And yet, she has sold billions. No one has come close to selling as many books as Agatha Christie has written. And I was always slightly puzzled as to why. Because of course she's good, but there's lots of other good writers. She dominates, way more. And I don't know why, but that questioning fit very nicely with that section that I was writing. And I finally came to the conclusion that Agatha Christie is so popular because, like Jesus 2,000 years ago, she makes death palatable. She makes death palatable by being incredibly entertaining. Any intelligent person knows they must meditate on their mortality, but we don't like doing that because mortality really sucks. Cancer, violence, murder is deeply, deeply dispiriting. But you read Agatha Christie and it's a joyous romp. And yet every murder mystery starts with a murder, but we joyously run around it. But it's not nihilistic joy. It is set within a moral framework. In every Agatha Christie, even when the murder victim is a heinous person, that person still did not deserve to die, and Hercule Poirot or Jane Marple have to figure out who did it and why. And there's such a joy in circling around that horrible moment, so that we're rubbing shoulders with death and we don't mind it. And I think in an unconscious way, we benefit from that, which is why I think we're so interested in crime mysteries and murder, And in a sense, Jesus did the same thing 2,000 years ago. He made death palatable. Not that Jesus was in any way entertaining. The Gospels are not particularly entertaining texts. I've never really bought this idea of the Bible as literature. The Bible is the Gospels are fairly dull documents. If you compare them to literature of that time, or the Homer or any of that stuff, it's way duller. But nonetheless, what Jesus did was make Jesus' death more palatable because he made it disappear. He made death just a threshold. He dies and then he resurrects. And he offers that possible trip to anyone else who believes in his story. So suddenly death is not a finality, which it always was before. Death was always terminal. Suddenly he said, it's just a threshold. Just believe in me, and it's just a bad little moment, just a little bad afternoon, and then everything will be fine. So suddenly death was less to be feared. And so they had the same result and curiously used the same techniques. That's one thing that it was a wonderful section to write, by the way. I point out the many, many similarities between the murder mysteries of Agatha Christie and the Gospels. So a very obvious one is the role of the witness. In any murder mystery, you have witnesses. Poirot will ask all the witnesses what happened, and he will sift through all their testimonies to come to the truth. Same thing with the Gospels. The witnesses are key. There's 4 Gospels, 4 different witnesses, and like any witness in a murder mystery, they do not say the same thing. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John do not say the same thing. They're 4 different takes with different facts, different stories on the same things. They sometimes contradict each other, like witnesses really do. And the more curious thing is that, as some of you who've read Agatha Christie will know, you read it, you're thrilled by it, you want to know who did it. You finally find out who did it, you're satisfied, and then 2 weeks later, you've completely forgotten who've done it. And you'll pick it up a year later and say, I read this one, who did it again? You know who the victim is, but you don't know who the victimizer is. How funny it is, the same thing with the Jesus story. We all know who the victim is, right? We all know Jesus dies. But who did it? Here's a very, very famous murder. You see, if I say JFK, if I say John Kennedy, we all immediately think Lee Harvey Oswald. We always know who did it somehow. There's that pendant of good and evil, and so we remember both. But with Jesus, if you ask anyone, who killed Jesus? it's not a question that is much asked. And people can't really, well, I don't know, well, some Roman soldiers, I presume, but is that it, really? That's all. Who took responsibility? Well, the Pontius Pilate, but he just sort of let it happen. Well, there's no, how curious that there's no answer really as to who was the victimizer. So there's so many similarities. And that was, and it fits in nicely with what I was trying to say. That section was a wonderful one to do.
I loved it.
And it fit very nicely with what I was trying to do, because obviously his wife, the pathologist's wife, brings her little theory up for a purpose, of course.
And you mentioned Agatha Christie always starts with something terrible, being the murder. You're often doing something or portraying something that's either disturbing or impossible or both before you get into the mystical. There's always something that's either really, really strange or quite discomforting. Do you need to do that to get to the themes you want to talk about, or is that's just the stories you tell? Are you conscious of that?
Yes and no. What's wonderful about literature, about fiction, is that it affords wonderful shortcuts to great insights, great truths. Allegory, magical realism, all these are tools that lead to insights very, very quickly that a more realistic, direct, testimonial kind of writing would take much longer to do, I feel. So I do it in a sense because it's what works. I use animals, for example, because they work. One thing that animals do as characters in stories is that usually readers are less cynical of animals than they are of humans. We know our species too well, and we're very intolerant and cruel with our own species. If a ferry overturns in Bangladesh and 200 people die, you glance at it in the newspaper and you turn the page. If a car with, a trailer with 6 horses is in an accident and the 6 horses burn to death, we feel a revulsion. We feel the innocence of those poor animals to be burned to death. Especially if someone committed arson and burned to death, 6 horses, we feel that pains us more. Somehow we project a lot onto animals, so they're just useful characters, I find. So I use all these techniques to try to get at what I'm trying to get.
A little bit on the mechanics of writing the book. I love that you've appeared to have written most of that book at your walking desk.
Yeah.
Which I want to get into it because I've read about walking desks. I'm fascinated by them. But a few of the things in the book, Tomas who walks backwards, the autopsies. You went and tried to experience these things yourself.
Yeah, some stories work well when they're fable-like in their tone. The ones that I happen to tell, I like rooting them in a sort of a reality. So Life of Pi is very realistic in its tone. The same thing with the High Mountains of Portugal. So there's an autopsy performed in the middle section of the High Mountains of Portugal. And so to properly know what I was talking about, I read a whole bunch of pathology textbooks from that time to sort of see what was the state of knowledge at that time in terms of pathology, with the language they used. But then I also went to see in Saskatoon, a very kind pathologist allowed me to see 3 autopsies. 3 live in one sense, autopsies. And it was a very, very interesting, I'm not particularly squeamish. I used to volunteer in palliative care, so I'm not particularly squeamish. It was very interesting seeing the inside of a body. From textbooks and images, you see it'll be like a puzzle with neat little pieces, very clear borders, like a Fauvist kind of painting. It's not. A body's like this messy stew. And the pathologist has a keen eye for what is what, but the untrained eye, is like a big goulash and very sloppy looking. And the organs are curiously unimpressive in some ways, considering what they do. So it was a very, very interesting. One thing, for example, is you wouldn't believe how canary yellow your body fat is, and how like roast beef your flesh is. And what's interesting is, and this goes to the heart of things, how death has immediately a story. So the first autopsy I saw was an older gentleman, and that was fine because it fits in the order of things that elderly people should die. And he was quite elderly; he was in his 80s. But the second one was a young man, a First Nations, indigenous person, in his mid-20s. And just looking at him, you can tell he'd had a rough life, and he died of an overdose. So you could tell this was a man who woke up one morning not knowing this was going to be his last morning. So that was sad. And then the third one was slim, educated pharmacist in his early 40s who died of something called hantavirus, which you get when you breathe in the fecal matter of mice. You don't want to breathe in, like if an old barn that's been closed for a long time, you go in to sort of sweep it away. If you should sweep up and in the air there should be the dried fecal matter of mice, don't breathe that in, because you'll get hantavirus, which is a terrible, terrible way to die. You basically drown, you drown. And his lungs were like a sponge full of water. So to see that, it was very useful for my book and sort of salutary to sort of see what a strange tightrope life is, with all these different things all walking on the rope, and if one thing falls off, then they all cascade and they all fall off.
Why does he walk backwards, Thomas, in the first?
Well, as he said, he was objecting. He loses everything. He loses his lover, their son, and his father, all in one catastrophic week. And I think when people who suffer, I remember this from my Holocaust novel, people who suffer need ways to deal with that if they don't want to sink into psychosis, and many of them do, psychosis and depression, all kinds of things. So Tomas is desperately searching for ways to cope with it. And because, grief, the terrible thing about grief is its solitude. Of course, the object of grief itself is terrible, but then it's the utter solitude of it, especially individual tragedies. Group tragedies are also horrific, the Holocaust, for example. But at least there's the slight comfort of knowing that you're not alone, either in the tragedy or in the survivors who react to it. Individual grief often is lost in the crowd. You've lost your wife or your son. Briefly, people are sympathetic, and then they move on with their lives. So there's the terrible solitude of it. So Tomas is trying to find a way of, what can I do with that? And the first thing he finds is, I'll walk backwards, to turn my back on the world, and to turn my back on God, and to and look back on the past that has been generous. So it's his way of objecting, and then that's the lead up to the next thing he does, which is to look for this object, which will be his second way at getting back at what happened to him. And to me, it just worked for me. I can't even remember where I got that. But I practiced it too. I practiced walking backwards.
How'd it go?
Well, the curious thing with walking backwards is you'd be surprised at how it's not a question of the proper use of your eyes. You glance backwards and you're safe for 10 meters. The thing about walking backwards is figuring out the mechanics of walking. When you walk forwards, you very naturally, the way you lift your feet comes very naturally. It comes in a completely unthinking way. And your stride comes naturally. When you start walking slowly, fast, you very naturally fall into a particular stride, and it comes completely naturally. Walking backwards, your stride, you have to figure out what's a natural stride, and how high you lift your foot. You have to actually think about it. So that's what I spent a lot of time, is figuring out the proper mechanics of a comfortable walk backwards. And it was actually quite fun. I quite enjoyed it. You do let your eyes wander because they don't need it as much. They quickly glance, and then you it's a very restful way of ambulating, but then you just have people looking at you. So you have to develop, like he does in the novel,
yes,
a certain obliviousness to people staring at you and commenting.
I knew it was a good book when I was rereading it to have a chat with you. So it's a richly rewarding experience. And every time I came across another interview or another article on it, I'd pick up new themes, and that's when it's a book that you can keep mining. I just wonder, far more generally, we live in a world, this is very much my professional world, everyone's doing their own thing. Everyone is hearing their own message. Everyone only maybe hears the message that they want to hear. Are you a bit of an evangelist? Are you positive about the impact, say, that a book can have? Or do you feel like you're just delivering something to people who... I don't know, are you preaching to the choir, or do you feel like as though there is a way in which books can produce change, get people to tilt their heads in a direction that might be beneficial to them and others?
Oh, very much so. I mean, books have changed the world. The obvious one, for example, historically, is the Gospels. The Gospels were oral tales that circulated for 30, 40, 50, 60 years until four people who we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John the latest, wrote them down. Those stories of an illiterate, Aramaic-speaking peasant from Nowheresville, Nazareth is Nowheresville, changed the world because they were written down. Donald Trump says his favorite book was the Bible. The books remain. Now, the medium in which we tell these important things is changing. I have nothing wrong with ebooks. I love ebooks. You know, an ebook can carry 2,000 books in it. I think we are story animals, and I think stories can change us. And some are better ways of telling stories, and I think books really are the best because they're so long, because they're so subtle, because you explore them alone, because you're free in how you interpret them. You know, a movie is a kidnapping. You have the images, you're told what they are because they're right in front of you. You have the music to tell you what emotional color that scene has. It's really a kidnapping, and that can be wonderful to lose yourself in that. But it doesn't go as deep because you're not as involved, especially in very commercial cinema. Books, you know, it's a bit of squiggles on the page. You create the movie by reading it, and that's why it can go so deep. So I myself have been transformed by books. Recently, the Iliad. I'd never read the Iliad. It's a mind-blowing book. As a result of that, I'm writing a book that's inspired by the Iliad. So books have changed my life. What's changed, I think, in the last long while, is the variety of stuff we read. You know, the canon, the Western canon has been blown up. And to some things, I think that's great. You know, personally, this is my personal, completely ignorant opinion, I'm kind of fed up with Shakespeare. It's kind of like people who still obsess about the Beatles. Yes, the Beatles are wonderful, but it's been 50 years, guys. There's other bands out there that are good. Yes, Shakespeare's a genius, but after 400 years, can we move on a little bit? So I'm happy that Shakespeare is being relativized a bit, you know. So I think the canon has been exploded, and new things are coming in. And that diversity of voices...
Does it weaken the power of the book, the diversity of voices, or strengthen it?
No, I think it strengthens it because I think new books come to the fore. Now, some may be technically weaker. You know, some people that we're looking at are maybe not as great as Shakespeare, but they're saying things from a community that is different. You know, I had this project where I sent books to the Prime Minister of Canada, and as a result, I read widely books because I was trying to. He is an ignorant man. He's now gone, thank God. And so, one of the books I sent him was a wonderful American novel called "Their Eyes Were Watching God," by Zora Neale Hurston, African American woman from the 1920s. The language is stunning. Yeah, that's what's wonderful about English. English is not one language. English is dozens of languages. One of them which is the African American English. And Their Eyes Were Watching God, which was published, I forget now, in the 20s or 30s, is like nothing that I ever read. Its renewal of the English language was extraordinary. And in a time of diversity now she's a classic. Now she's read all over the U.S. Yeah. It's a great... So I think that's wonderful. And also, books from other cultures have come to the fore much more. And I'm a result. You know, if you had to name my favorite writers, you know, Knut Hamsun, a Norwegian writer, Hunger, that blew me away when I was a young man. Some of the Japanese writers, like Yukio Mishima, The Sailor Fell from Grace with the Sea. All the Russians, I loved all the Russians. Tolstoy, Dostoevsky, Gogol, Turgenev, all those, Goncharov, all those people, I love them. I all read them in translation. You know, so that exploding I like. The one slight difficulty is that if you have a canon that's too exploded, you don't necessarily have a society that has one narrative that it can go to. Reference. Yes, so that makes it problematic. You have people who start creating their own reality, which in some ways is fine if it's sort of imaginative. But in politics, for example, we do have to come together and agree if we're going to live together. And if people have radically different narratives, and you see that in the U.S., for example, people who have completely different visions of the world, and they have to live together, and they're not.
No agreed facts.
No agreed facts, exactly. So that gets problematic. But we'll just have to work that out somehow. But no, I love that completely exploded canon.
Look, I want to give everyone a chance to ask questions, but I also like to ask one other thing. Do you watch much TV? Is there anything that you find revelatory about TV, or is it just a bit of junk? Or
when I was a kid, it's funny, just yesterday with Jane, my publicist, we were talking about Skippy the kangaroo, which I remember loving, you know, Skippy the bush kangaroo. But now when I look back at TV at that time, it was terrible.
Yeah.
It was so objectionable. Now TV, I mentioned Game of Thrones. I love Game of Thrones. It's amazing. I met the guy who wrote it. I don't think the books are as good. I haven't read them, but the TV show is amazing. But things like Mad Men, about the advertising industry, it's theatrical. It's so layered and subtle and well written. Because TV, you have so many hours on these. Yeah. You know, a feature-length movie at most is 2.5 hours. That's not much time to have an effect. A TV series that goes on for years, You live with those characters like you would in a Russian novel for a long time. And there's really good writers now. And there's
Yes.
so I don't watch much because I have 4 children. I have these 4 little Russian novels running around me. But I periodically binge. So, Mad Men, Dexter. So they're
right.
mostly American. If you're asking me about some great
No,
Australian
that's okay.
television, I don't know any Australian television other than Skippy. So I'm a little bit out of date here.
It's a bit better than Skippy these days.
Yeah, okay.
Now, look, I have plenty of my own questions, but there is a chance for you to ask your own.
Hi, I'd like to know more about the walking desk that was mentioned briefly before.
Oh, it's called the Treadmill Desk, and it's a treadmill like you have in a gym where you run, but instead you walk at about 1.2 miles an hour, and you have a desk. So in a sense, you're standing up like this, and you're walking, and you have a desk at the right height. So you can't handwrite very well, and you can't use a mouse. You use a trackpad. But I wrote this entire novel walking, and it sounds like kind of corny, but I also sometimes read walking backwards on it. There I slowed down to about 0.5, and peripherally you can see the edge of the treadmill, and I just sort of walk. Because as they say now that walking is sort of like the new smoking. You shouldn't be sitting down for 8 hours.
Sitting is the new smoking.
So what did I say?
Walking.
No, sitting is the new smoking. So walking, you shouldn't be sitting for 8 hours in a row. So I used to spend 6-7 hours walking at my treadmill desk. I love them. And there's a number of writers in Saskatoon, where I live in Western Canada, who
It's
have...
it's getting bigger and bigger in North America, isn't it?
No,
the
it's
walking
a
desk,
wonder. Even offices, businesses will have them now too for their employees. It's a great way. It's the same motion you're doing, but you're still not sitting. You're moving your body. As I said, you can vary the speed. You can sometimes walk backwards. I love it.
Just a quick aside, have you done walking meditation?
No.
Okay. It's an interesting experience. I recommend it heartily to all of you. Anybody else? Got a question? Sorry, down here.
Oh.
It's down the front here, sorry.
There's a lady there.
Thanks, Yann. I love the book, but I have to ask, the autopsy. I was trying to figure out, was
spoilers.
that an allegory? I know, spoiler
Yeah,
alert. Without saying exactly what was found, was that an allegory for something specific? Because I was trying to make sense of it to myself, and I was at a bit of a loss.
In the... well, do I spoil it or not? Yes, so the novel, the part 2, there's an autopsy, which takes a sort of magical realist turn. I wanted the objects, what you're referring to sort of echo the life of the character of Raphael. So I wanted the different... Yeah, Raphael, come to think of it. To reflect his life. So each of the objects can stand for something from his life. One specifically is just a wink at my own writing, in that, remember, he finds a little red band. In my previous book, in Beatrice and Virgil, there's a red cloth of suffering. And I brought that in that book, and I'll probably, in every single book, there'll be a red cloth. Everything I write now, I also, if you noticed in the book, and maybe you didn't notice, in fact, I should check.
There's an animal in a boat with a person in this
there
book
should
too.
be a word. Let me just check. My publisher's here. Heads will roll if it's not there. Aukits. Is it not there, Michael? Oh dear.
You're looking at the front there.
Yeah, oh, it's not there somehow.
He's looking at like that page that has all the boring
There was
copyright
supposed to
stuff.
be a little word. Yeah, the boring copyright page. There's supposed to be a word which I...
Very important.
Oh
the boring
dear.
copyright
I'll talk. Anyway, as a result of being preoccupied with the Holocaust, I want everything I write to be written in the light of it. Just means that I've taken, as much as I can, possession, taken stock of it, and I want everything to be written after that. So the red cloth of suffering is from Beatrice and Virgil, and it's going to be... But all the other things, it is there. Oh, on what page?
Mine's the faulty one. Yeah, no, he's on that page. He's on the copyright page.
Is this a reading? Oh, where is it on this page? Where is it on yours?
Where's the word? Oh, yes, it is too.
Where is it on
And
this
is it
one?
on this one?
Well, I don't see.
It's not on mine, and it is on yours. I got the mystery copy. There you go. There you go.
There's a word that is published in the copyright page at right angle, Aukitz, A-U-K-I-T-Z, which I want to put in every one of my books. So, but other than that, they're all hints at the life that he's led, and some are fairly obvious, agricultural implements. Others are more elliptical in their significance, and the writer's invited to sort of try to construct something from it. Because I've always... when I went to I went to a boarding school for 2 years, my last 2 years of high school in Canada, and my roommate was a sociopath, and one expression of that was that he destroyed every material thing that I had. I had a little sculpture of a dodo bird that my grandmother had bought when she traveled around the world and she went to Mauritius, where the dodo bird used to live. So I had this cute little sculpture of a dodo bird, which was my one sort of material connection to my grandmother. Well, he destroyed it. And I had a big UN flag, some sort of pie-in-the-sky idealism. He very artfully, it was folded up because I had nowhere to put it on my walls. He very artfully ripped it apart so that folded up it looked like it was all right. But then as soon as I opened up, it turned to be all this completely torn to shreds. So he was a vicious prick. And I realized at age 16 that I had two possible reactions. Either the American one of, build up walls, fortifications around my possessions, or let go. And I chose the let go route. I still have my grandmother in my mind, in my heart. I'll let go of the dodo bird. I'll let go of the UN. So I very consciously, I remember at that age, decided to not care about things. And so I'm always interested in the relationship between objects and feelings. And so those objects, I was looking at what they might represent to a life. How do we summarize a life in objects? What objects would truly be significant for someone? So in my own life, for example, I had a girlfriend in my early 20s from Germany, a lovely young woman, and eventually it didn't work out for various reasons, mainly the Atlantic got in the way. But once she gave me a shaving brush, a little, what's the animal? A badger, that she got, and it came as a complete surprise, and I've had it for 30 years now, and I consciously decide this is important to me. I've consciously decided this shaving brush is important to me. Not only because of her, I've sort of gone beyond her, but just this is from my past, from a moment, and so it's whereas everything else around it is unimportant, but I've consciously invested that one with meaning. So I just looking at object that might speak of someone's life, but the reader sort of invited to construct a biography based on those objects.
And one thing just listening to you talk and having heard you talk previously, there seems so much, for lack of a better phrase, metaphysical intent in what you write. Are they separate? Does the story come to you and then the intent? Do you have the intent and then the story? Do you discriminate between the two?
I think I'd usually say it's the intent. So Life of Pi was very consciously an attempt to understand faith, religion. Right.
And then you found the story to do that?
Yes, exactly. My first novel, a good example is my first novel, Self, which is obscure. It sold 500 copies in Canada. No, 1,000. So it was my collection of short stories that sold 500 copies. Self was the result of a number of things. I took Psych 101 at university, introductory psychology course, and which is a great thing to take for an obtuse young man like I was. And one of the things that was pointed out in the course of this thing was all these fascinating studies that people conducted. One of which pointed out that men, I can't remember what the percentage was, but men interrupt women far more than women interrupt men. And I said, oh, how interesting. And in the following weeks, I noticed how often I'd interrupt women. And I'd realized that, oh my God, I just interrupted her. This is something gender-based. Because I think of myself as a good person. And then in the experience of life, you find out ways in which you're not so good. So I don't have a homophobic bone in my body. That I know. I have no problems with gays and lesbians whatsoever. I know that. I don't think of myself being racist, although having moved to Saskatchewan, which is riven by racism, it's an intoxicating, poisonous environment. And when you're in an environment where there's a them and us, there's us and the First Nations, and it's hard to try to ignore that, the way I ignore whether someone's gay or lesbian. It makes no consequence to me. So there you have to consciously pull out. But it was an ugly discovery in my late teens going to university, these sexist tendencies. For example, that I would interrupt women more than men. And also in that same course, there were studies conducted where they asked little boys and little girls what would happen if they woke up and they were the other sex. And the study showed how the response of girls to be told that you woke up one day and you're a boy was far more varied and mitigated than that of boys. So girls would say, oh, if I was a boy, I could play hockey. I could climb trees. I could be a doctor. This is obviously old studies. Whereas boys, it was uniformly, to a boy, horrific. The idea of waking up a girl was horrible. It would be a nightmare. And I was struck by that. Like, why is that? Where does that come from? So Self came from a very conscious attempt to explore that. So in Self is the story of a boy who's a boy for 18 years, and on his 18th birthday, while traveling in Portugal, after eating sweet potato, he wakes up and he's a woman. He metamorphosizes into a woman. So it's kind of like Orlando, not as good, but he turns out she's a woman for 7 years, and then she wakes up again, or she actually metamorphoses again into a man. So I was exploring not only what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, but also sexual orientation, because he is a run-of-the-mill heterosexual boy, and then when he turns into a woman, she is initially in the body of a woman, but it still operates in some ways like a man, so is attracted to women. So she has some lesbian relationships. But then eventually, because one of the ideas I was exploring was the idea of the body being an environment. Just as, people who live in hot countries tend to be thinner, people who live in temperate countries tend to be heavier set. The Inuit are heavier set than the Hottentots of Africa. We adapt to our environment. I was thinking of the body being an adaptation of, what is the difference between having a penis as opposed to having a vagina? How would that affect your way of thinking? So she slowly becomes heterosexual, and then when she becomes a man again, once again, she's thinking like a woman, so she has affairs with men. So I was exploring that idea in a very personal way. So there it started with because I thought, how's the best way to get rid of sexism? Is to be the other. So in my case, to be a woman. So I did my research. I read all the feminist classics. I spoke to a lot of women, trying to find out what it meant to be a woman. As far as people know who they are, so you have to ask them and try to figure out to what extent they're self-aware of what it means to be what they are, whether it's be Australian or tall or white or a woman or a man. So I'd ask conversations with women about being a woman, whether it's their period or orgasms or what it's like to have breasts, trying to figure out to what extent they could say something that I would understand. And then I just close my eyes and try to imagine myself in the body of a woman. So there it was very much an idea that dictated the kind of thinking I would do, that would dictate the kind of research I would do, and eventually entailed the kind of story that I wrote. And that process has been the same for all my books. The first book was a collection of short stories. I was exploring what stories mean, how we come to create stories, what they mean. So that's been my process throughout. So usually it's an idea, as I said, an emotive idea, then followed by. And the last thing that comes actually is character. I never think in terms of character.
Right.
That's
A lot of writers start with character.
I know. Well, they must know something I don't. I always think with idea and story, and then the characters eventually arise. And they definitely don't speak to me. I tell them what to do. It's also a thing that I'm puzzled when people say my characters speak to me and I just take dictation. To me, it's the opposite. They take dictation. They do what I tell them to do.
Oh, I'm so pleased I got an answer to that. I was just rereading this, asking myself that question. Anybody else got a question? There's a gentleman in the middle there. Just do me a favour, wait for the microphone, just so we can all hear the question. If you don't mind passing along the row.
I'll admit I didn't fully understand all of the book, but its ability to transport me to another world was wonderful. Why Portugal? Do you have any connection with Portugal?
None whatsoever. It's sort of one of these happenstances that I just happened to be the first country I traveled to on my own. I traveled a lot as a boy with my parents who were diplomats for the Canadian Foreign Service. So we lived in France and Costa Rica, and earlier on in Alaska, where my father taught at the University of Alaska. But I always traveled with my parents. But Portugal, my parents were posted in Spain, in Madrid. And one summer when I was 20, I was going to go and visit them, and I thought, instead of just flying directly to Madrid and being with them, why don't I fly somewhere else and do that amazing thing, apparently, called backpacking? And so I thought, what's the closest place I could fly to that's, not too far away that I'd start getting really nervous? Well, it's Portugal, Lisbon. So I flew into Lisbon, and I backpacked around Portugal for about 3 weeks or so. And it was a marking experience to be a lone element in a foreign reality, especially one where it really is foreign, where you don't speak the language, you don't share the religion, you don't particularly like the food. It was extraordinarily intense, and it marked me. And then I went back and I said I started to write this novel. So there was just a happenstance that I had this idea set in Portugal that stayed with me, but finally it fit thematically very nicely because I returned to Portugal. Why? Because in the High Mountains of Portugal, I very broadly wanted to write an allegory of the life of Jesus. In fact, the very earliest incarnations of this novel are radically different. This is the book actually that has gone through the most transformation from beginning to end. So the very beginning of this novel was a casual observation I made one day when I was moving a Bible that I didn't need anymore because I'd finished Life of Pi. Been there, done that. In looking at it, I opened it, and I noticed in this particular gospel, which was the New Revised Standard Version, that all the gospels have little chapter headings. You know, Jesus cures a leper. All these little chapter headings. These are not original to the Gospels. They were added on by later writers to help navigate the text. I just happened to notice those casually. And I made the observation that, those little chapter headings are a very concise summary of the life of Jesus. Right? It starts with his birth in Matthew, and it ends with his passion. And I sort of noticed that these little chapter headings summarize his life. And I suddenly had this idea of, I wonder if I could write a novel in which I'd use these chapter headings and tell a completely different story that would somehow echo these chapter headings, that would be guided by them, either being similar or being in direct opposition to them. Because after all, what's interesting about Jesus as a religious phenomenon is, and when I say whether you have anything, if you have any feelings about Christianity or not, is that the life of Jesus in many ways resembles our lives in the sense that we are born, we try our best, and then we die. Jesus was born, tried his best, and he died. There's a parallel there that's much closer than with any other divine figure, be it Buddha or Krishna or Allah or whatever. Every other sort of religious character is more different from us than Jesus. The level of incarnation in Christianity is quite unique in religions. So it's a very close parallel. So I thought, what kind of life would someone following those same chapter headings, being born, suffering, trying their best and dying, what kind of story would that be? So the very first, and I can't remember if you ever saw those, Michael, my publisher is here, was this story where instead of having in this book as it is now, there's 3 sections with no chapter headings, nothing. It's just one solid, 3 times a solid text. Initially, the first version was like in 76, I forget how many chapters there are in Mark, but it was a novel in 76 chapters. I liked it, my editors hated it. They said, first of all, most of us, and most people are completely unaware of the Gospels anymore. The canon has been shattered, and no one reads the Bible anymore unless you're of a certain age or are brought up Catholic. Or not Catholic, actually. It's more the Protestants who know their Bible really well. All these chapter headings, first of all, made them feel that they were stupid. Like they had to figure out the connection, so they had to pull out the Gospel, read them, which means they were getting out of my story. And sometimes they would get it, and there's that moment of satisfaction that I got it. And then when they wouldn't get it, then they felt kind of dumb. So they said that doesn't work. So first step was I got rid of the chapter headings. But there was also a close parallel. So I'll give you one example. In the first section, Tomás is traveling through Portugal on this car. And at one point, he starts feeling itchy. He's just sort of scratching himself a bit. And then he says, it gets really worse. Then suddenly he's completely he's scratching himself practically to death. He's completely overtaken by lice or fleas. He doesn't know what. And at one point he wonders, who gave me this? How is it that I got what peasant gave me his infestation of lice such that I'm scratching myself till there's blood under my fingernails? That episode echoes in the Gospel of Mark that scene when Jesus meets the woman who has a hemorrhage. There's a woman who's been hemorrhaging for 12 years. She sees the Lord go by. She says, I wonder if this might help. And she comes up to him and she touches the hem of his garment. And she's instantly cured. And Jesus feels the power go out of him. And he turns around and he says, who touched me? Who touched me? And she says, I did, Lord. Please forgive me. She says, it's fine. Go. Very lovely scene. The scenes are always lovely in the Gospels. These very, very lovely encounters. But that echoes Matt. Tomás asks himself the same question. Who touched me? Who touched me? In this case, it's not divine power that goes out of him. It's the peasant gives him an infestation of lice. So there was all these echoes or parallels. But finally, a novel has to serve its story. So some of these things were too long when it didn't work. So not only did I delete certain references to these Gospels, so the novel went from being in 76 chapters to one single text, to having sections taken out. So suddenly chapters that echoed the Mark were gone. And then also you have to tell the story in a way that works. So suddenly I changed the order of some of these things now. But so the earliest parts followed very closely that, and then mutated until you get the final, what you have there. And I can't remember your question.
It was about Portugal. You took us to good places.
Oh, and so that's it. If it echoes the life of Jesus, Palestine was a completely unimportant part of the Roman Empire. It was of no consequence. And yet something happened there that changed the empire. So I needed a country on the edges of Europe. And Portugal is on the edges of Europe. It is, by today's standards, a less important country, so to speak, than, it's not one of the motors of the EU. It's not Germany, it's not France, it's not the UK. It's sort of on the periphery. So I wanted a peripheral country, and I wanted, within that peripheral country, a minor area. As I said, Nazareth was nowhere. There's no mention of Nazareth in the Old Testament. So I wanted the High Mountains, so this sort of totally lost part of Portugal. So Portugal nicely fit that desire for somewhere that was sort of echoed what Palestine was like. So there was a case of happenstance finally became meaningful. My story took it on.
There you go.
There you go.
I think we've got time for... no, we don't have time for one more question. There you go. Yann will be signing books at the bookshop, so you're more than welcome to go along there, have a copy signed. I'm actually doing it in the book club on my radio show on ABC Radio. If you want to know more with that, forgive me, just use the words Read with Raf. Put it into Google. It'll get you to the part of ABC Radio where I am and the book club is. But...
Thank you to you. Well, thank you to you. Thank you to Raf. Thank you very much for coming. It's wonderful being in
and
Australia.
let's give Yann a round of applause.